Today's lecture is going to be talking about the chemical building blocks of life. What we're going to explore are the different elements or atoms necessary to form the basic macromolecules that make up all living organisms. When we take a look at this, carbon is the main building block. Carbon is found in all living organisms. It's one of the main elements that we'll see across all of life. Now what I want you guys to do is think about how many bonds would carbon typically form. So this should tie back to the earlier lecture when we talked about atomic weight, atomic number, figuring out protons, neutrons, and electrons. The key here is looking at how many electrons carbon has, which can be determined by that atomic number. So that would tell us 6. And then the electrons sit in those orbital shells or orbital rings, whichever term we want to use, it's fine. So if there's 6 electrons, 2 go in the first ring, and then 4 go in the second ring. Now, based on the octet rule, the second ring should have ideally 8 electrons in it. If carbon has 4, and it wants to get to 8, it's going to try to grab 4 more electrons from other elements. So that means carbon tends to form 4 additional bonds. These are typically covalent bonds where carbon shares the electrons. Now it might be 4 single covalent bonds, it might be 2 double covalent bonds, or 2 singles and 1 double. Whatever the case, carbon's trying to form 4 additional bonds with anybody, any element that it can get a hold of to ideally create stability. Quite often, it likes to get together with hydrogens. Now, when carbon attaches to hydrogens, it often needs additional groups to attach to. These are what we call functional groups. So quite often we'll have what we call hydrocarbon chain. Carbon, hydrogen, etc. And then attached to the chain is one of these things we call a functional group. These are kind of like, for poor example, the hydrocarbon chain is Mr. Potato Head, and the functional group are the glasses that you put on, or the hat, or the funny nose. So looking at the list here, these are all functional groups. Hydroxyl, carbonyl, carboxyl, etc. Those tend to be attached to hydrocarbon chains. When they get attached, they start creating certain molecules. So what we'll see is, take your basic hydrocarbon chain, Mr. Potato Head body, and then stick different functional groups on there, you create various molecules. Now, when we look at molecules, 3 terms I want you to make sure you're familiar with: isomer, monomer, and polymer. Now, an isomer is going to be 2 structures that have exactly the same molecular formula, but the molecules are arranged in different patterns, and that creates different structures. So if you take a look at the example here, glyceraldehyde, 3 carbons, 3 oxygens, 6 hydrogens. Dihydroxyacetone, 3 carbons, 6 hydrogens, 3 oxygens. Same exact formula, just arranged differently. So imagine taking a pile of Legos, how many different shapes can you make with the same exact pile of Legos? That's what we call an isomer. Now, lots of the things we're going to look at throughout food and chemistry and these chemical building blocks of life are going to be isomers. Sometimes you eat something, your body digests it, and just simply rearranges the combination of elements, and it produces something different. Same basic ingredients, formed into a different substance. Second term, make sure you're comfortable with, is monomer. Mono means one or single. It's often a small subunit. Polymer is lots or many. Polymers are going to be large molecules. Generally, growth happens when a bunch of small molecules, or monomers, are combined to form a polymer. Digestion happens when you eat something, the big structure, the polymer, is chopped up into smaller and smaller little pieces called monomers. So what we'll see is growth happens when you create polymers, energy gets produced digestion occurs, etc., when polymers are broken down into monomers. Okay, so as we look at reactions and chemical reactions within the body, we're going to see two types, and these are opposite of each other. So if you memorize one, the other one exactly the opposite. A dehydration reaction, it's also known as condensation, is when you combine monomers to create a polymer, growth. During this reaction, and we can see this on the left-hand side of your view here on the A, dehydration reaction, water is released. So you're dehydrating. You're losing water when these two little monomers are combined to form the larger polymer. In a hydrolysis reaction, it's exactly the opposite. You're going to use water, attach it to a polymer, a big substance, and it's going to bust it in half. Hydro means water. Lysis means to break. So in a hydrolysis reaction, B, on your right-hand side of your screen, water is used to break apart a large substance, and it breaks it down into two smaller substances. But it uses water. It has to have water for its reaction. So everything we talk about with food and energy and pathways involve these two reactions. Growth, digestion, building, decay, dehydration, hydrolysis. All right? So again, make sure you're comfortable with these reactions and how they work. So as we explore the chemistry and the molecules of life, we're looking at four groups of what we call macromolecules. Now, macro just means big molecules, big, large molecules. We're going to have carbohydrates, we're going to have nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids. Those are the four groups of macromolecules we'll explore. What I want you guys to make sure you're comfortable with, look at this picture, make sure when, not if, but when you're asked, tell me the monomer of a carbohydrate or the monomer of a nucleic acid. You know what the simplest form is, but can you also give examples of the big form? So if you eat a potato or a piece of starch, what is it broken down into? What's the monomer of that carbohydrate? If you consume amino acids and you need to build it into a polypeptide, the polymer, how does that work? Again, we'll get into these individual groups as we go through the next couple lectures, but this image right here is a great figure or image to use as a good reference for the four groups of macromolecules. Again, think about it like food. Carbs, proteins, lipids, we eat that stuff every day. And every time you consume any type of cell, you're getting nucleic acids. It's the DNA and the genetic material found inside the nucleus of the cell that you're eating. So the hamburger that we had for lunch had protein, had lipids, had carbohydrates probably for the bun, and there's DNA inside the cells of that hamburger. It came from a cow. The bun probably came from wheat. DNA is there, so are the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the lipids. Okay, so let's take a look at carbs. Oh, before we get to those though, let's briefly take a look at the USDA recommended daily intake. This is very general guidelines. Every one of us is different, but generally the recommendation is about 55% of your food intake should come from carbohydrates, roughly 30% from fats, about 15% of your calories should be coming from proteins. Nucleic acids automatically coming in as you eat everything that has a nucleus. So keep in mind this recommendation is very generalized. It will change. If you guys are into sports, you're athletic, you need to up your protein content to repair your muscles. If you're trying to lose weight and trying to reduce body fat, shift, change, adjust, slide the fat content down a little bit, increase the protein, maybe you need to increase the carbs based upon your activities. So keep in mind this is a very general guideline. We're all different, our bodies are different, we need to figure out individually what works for us, and the big reality of energy and nutrition and weight loss, there's no magical pill to make everybody perfect and in shape. It just takes time, patience, being smart, and having some awareness of how your body works. And that's hopefully what we can get from some of this chapter as we go through these different food groups. Alright, now let's tackle carbohydrates. When we look at a carbohydrate, carbohydrates are composed primarily of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in the ratio 1 carbon for every 2 hydrogens to every 1 oxygen. Most common one, glucose, C6H12O6. That carbohydrate follows the 1-to-1 ratio. It is a monomer. So make sure you guys are familiar with some of these. Okay, so our primary role of carbs when we eat them is to give us energy. That's why we consume carbs. If you're an athlete, you sometimes carbo load the night before your event. Swimmers in the Olympics, marathon runners, people going out to do a 5K. Carbohydrates provide us with energy. It is a form of energy that our body can take, convert, and use very easily. The challenge in the American society is that we often consume way too much in regards to calories and energy. We overconsume beyond belief, and if we don't burn it, our body stores it. There's the challenge. And we'll get into this more with metabolism and energy, but I don't want anybody to think carbs are bad or carbs are evil. In general, and put a red star next to this, make sure you guys write it down, 1 gram of carbohydrates will give you 4 kilocalories of energy. It's a 1-to-4 ratio. So if you needed 4,000 kilocalories of energy, you'd need 1,000 grams of carbohydrates. Okay, so that is our return of energy when we look at carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates come in 3 general forms: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and poly. Monosaccharides are simple sugars. Those chocolate candy right there. Good stuff. Great energy. But it's fast, quick, goes into your system, and then it's burned out real quick. So glucose, fructose, simple sugars. You eat a bunch of that, you get that sugar rush, but then you have the crash. This is why you don't try to sustain yourself on simple sugars or monosaccharides. It's a good pick-me-up, but it's not going to give you sustained energy for any duration. Now, disaccharides are 2 monosaccharides pushed together. You can see that down on the bottom there. Glucose and fructose pushed together through that reaction, forming sucrose. Sucrose is a common table sugar. It's found in fruits. So when you eat an apple, a grape, a peach, a pear, you're typically getting sucrose. Your body takes a sucrose, and it has to chop it in half down to glucose, and then glucose goes into the cell and becomes energy. So digestion has to happen, which means you don't get the sugar rush. It goes in a little bit slower, but that apple will last you longer when we talk about energy output than those chocolate balls up top there. Our third category of carbohydrates are polysaccharides. These are the big, complex carbs. We have starch, we have cellulose, we have glycogen, we have chitin. Now, starch is plant-based. Cellulose is plant-based. Glycogen is animal-based. And chitin is animal-based. It can also be found in fungi. Now, the human body has the ability to digest starch and glycogen. We can break that down. We can digest it. We cannot digest cellulose or chitin. Cellulose is what we use as roughage. Bran flakes. Helps with moving food, moving nutrients, and moving things through our digestive system. But we can't break it down. Animals like cows and deer and rabbits, they can break down cellulose because they have the necessary stomach bacteria and enzymes for that digestion. Starch, on the other hand, we can break it down. We consume it. We have the enzymes to digest it. Our body will break it down, and we will use it. But it's got to chop it down into glucose, which takes time. I mean, we're talking hours. Eat a baked potato, it takes hours to get that entire potato digested down to glucose in order for it to go into the cell and become energy. Glycogen chops it down pretty quick. It's typically stored in the liver and only brought out as needed. and used as an energy source when our body needs it. Chitin, we can't digest it either.